Before you full screen the video or turn your phone sideways, hit that sub button. It took me a long time to make this video for many different reasons, but just hitting that subscribe button can really help out. It can help me get more content out to you guys much faster. If you like the video, then hit the like button too so that this video gets shown to more people across YouTube. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to decide to cover this case for you guys, since it's not really a cold case and it's pretty old also. But if you like to eat your dessert first and you just want to get straight to the story, then click here. Okay, so like I said, this video is not about a cold case. You see, after my last video about the Long Island serial killer, I fell into sort of a serial killer pit. We all know the big famous ones, so we're not going to talk about them today. But I did find some interesting cases. I thought about which ones I'd like to share with you all today, and I settled on this one because it is particularly interesting to me. It's from the early 1800s, and I found it interesting for many reasons, but one reason was this change in how the public viewed death throughout the years. It went from reverence and a whole lot of ceremonies surrounding funerals and such to this callousness in the early 19th century that was it was an interesting contrast to me. And in addition, the change in values, in public values during this time, really enabled the two men we're going to talk about today to commit their crimes. Now, it is worth noting that the chronological timeline of Burke and Hare's victims is difficult to ascertain due to the inconsistencies of their confessions. Because of this, and because of the age of the cases, some of the details in this video are fuzzy to say the very least. So I'm sorry if I get some of the details wrong. With that said, let's get to the story. In the early 19th century, Europe was experiencing a significant demand for cadavers for medical study. This demand was fueled by the rise of anatomical studies, which became an essential component of medical education. However, with the limited supply of legally obtained bodies, a new industry emerged: the trade in corpses obtained by grave robbers. Now, at this time, medical schools were often limited to the number of cadavers they could legally obtain. The demand for bodies was far outstripping the supply of legally obtained corpses. As a result, medical schools were forced to resort to illegal ways of accumulating these bodies. This led to the rise of grave robbing, where bodies were stolen from cemeteries and sold to medical schools. Grave robbing was a lucrative business and attracted many individuals who were willing to break the law to make a profit. These grave robbers were known as resurrectionists. They would often target the graves of recently deceased, as the bodies were still fresh and in good condition for dissection. The demand for cadavers was particularly high in Edinburgh, Scotland, where the renowned anatomist Dr. Robert Knox taught at the University of Edinburgh. Knox was known for his innovative teaching methods, which included dissections in front of large audiences. To meet the demand for bodies, Knox relied heavily on the services of resurrectionists. Okay, the trade in corpses was not without controversy. Families of the deceased often discovered that their loved ones' bodies had been stolen and used for dissection. This led to obvious public outrage. It also led to the introduction of new laws such as the Anatomy Act of 1832 in the United Kingdom. This allowed for the legal donation of bodies for medical study and greatly reduced the demand for illegally obtained cadavers. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. The early 1800s was a wild time across Europe. Medical advances seemed to be happening at a breakneck speed, and like I said earlier, Dr. Knox had found a steady supply of fresh cadavers. It's exactly how he acquired his bodies that I want to examine today, because William Burke and William Hare were not your typical resurrectionists. Admittedly, the details in this section were hard to come by, but William Burke was born in 1792 in Tyrone, Ireland. Now, not much is known about his early life, but it is believed he was a laborer before joining the British Army. During this time, he married Margaret Coleman, and he served in the army for several years. Afterwards, he moved in with Margaret Coleman because his militia was disbanded in 1807. While living with his wife and her family, Burke had an ongoing argument with her father about leasing his land. Ultimately, because her father did not want to lease his land, the argument led Burke to just straight up leave his family and move to Scotland. He never returned to Ireland, and he never saw his wife again. William Hare, on the other hand, was born in 1792 in Armagh, Ireland. Like Burke, not much is known about his early life, but it is believed that he worked as a laborer and coal miner before moving to Scotland. Hare arrived in Edinburgh in early 1820 and opened a lodging house in the Westport area of the city. Douglas Skelton, who wrote a book on the case, said, "Little is known of Hare's early life other than it would have been a struggle to survive in one of the poorest parts of Ireland." Okay, let's go back to Burke. He found work at the docks in Hopetown, and there he met a woman named Helen McDougall. Helen was a widower, and she had 2 children to support. Burke and McDougall moved in together and essentially acted as a married couple. Think common law marriage. Although by all accounts, it was not a good relationship. They were both heavy drinkers, and they fought a lot. It was more of a marriage out of necessity. So they made their way to Edinburgh in 1827. Once there, they took up lodging in the boarding house owned by none other than William Hare and Margaret Laird. Now, by all reports, the boarding house was not a 5-star hotel. It catered to poor immigrants looking for work and traveling through the city, so this house was not very well maintained. The 2 men quickly became friends and began working together. Although, when I say working together, it's probably not what you all think. See, throughout 1828, Burke and Hare supplied Dr. Knox with up to 20 cadavers. Dr. Knox paid them well for these bodies, but were they just really good resurrectionists? Well, not quite. In fact, I would argue they were the complete opposite. Okay, so how could they get away with selling so many bodies to Dr. Knox? Well, to help explain that, we have to go back even a little farther. During the Victorian era, death was viewed with great reverence and respect. The dead were treated with the utmost care and attention, and funerals were often elaborate affairs. The bodies of the deceased were seen as sacred and deserving of respect, and it was believed that they should be treated with dignity and care. However, the early 19th century saw a significant shift in the way that cadavers were viewed. The demand for bodies for medical study had begun to increase, and there were simply not enough legally available bodies to meet that demand. This led to the rise in grave robbing that we had talked about, where bodies were illegally exhumed and sold to medical schools. To further compound the situation, medical schools required that students dissect 3 cadavers in order to earn their degrees. Since the bodies were so hard to acquire and they were expensive, schools started rolling those fees over into their students' tuition. So, in the point of view of the schools, more bodies equals more fees in student tuitions. This incentivized medical schools to purchase even more bodies. During the early 19th century, human dissections were not only performed for medical purposes, but they were also popular social events. People of all social classes would attend these dissections. One attendee of a public dissection in Edinburgh in 1828 described the experience as follows.
The room was crowded to suffocation, and the heat was almost insupportable. Ladies fainted, and several persons were carried out of the room in a state of insensibility.
Another attendee of a public dissection in London wrote,
The dissecting room is a strange and gruesome place, yet one cannot help being fascinated by the interest of the scene. There was a strange stillness in the room, broken only by the sharp sound of the saw and the lecturer's voice explaining the different parts of the body as he removed them.
These accounts highlight the morbid fascination with human dissections during this time period, as well as the crowded and often uncomfortable conditions in which they were held. Despite the potential for shock and disgust, people continued to attend these events out of a desire for knowledge and a fascination with the workings of the human body. Okay, let's focus in on Edinburgh. To put how much money these resurrectionists could make, let's talk about how much money the working class made. In the early 19th century Scotland, workers often earned as little as 5 to 10 shillings per week. Even very skilled workers made around 30 shillings per week. This was considered a good wage, and it allowed a person of this time to live comfortably. In Edinburgh, the going rate for a fresh body was around 7 to 10 pounds. However, the price could go all the way up to 20 pounds for a body that was particularly fresh and well preserved. For reference, 20 pounds is equal to 480 shillings, or 4 months' pay for a skilled worker. You can see how this led to an economic opportunity for some people of questionable morals who would definitely take advantage of it. In addition, the penalty that these grave robbers would face was a fine of up to 10 pounds. I mean, they also faced the social ramifications, but the reward greatly outweighed the risks. Someone could sell a fresh body for 20 pounds, and then if they were caught, and that's a big if, they'd face a 10-pound fine and get away with a clean 10 pounds. Around this time, cemeteries began implementing defensive measures to deter grave robbers from stealing freshly buried corpses. One common method was to build watchtowers overlooking the cemetery grounds, and they often employed guards to patrol the areas. Another tactic was to bury bodies in iron coffins, which were much more difficult to break into than traditional wooden coffins. Some cemeteries even installed morte-safe devices, which were iron cages placed over the graves to prevent thieves from digging down to the coffin. Additionally, many cemeteries began to use body snatcher traps. These were buried pits filled with sharpened wooden stakes, and these traps were placed in strategic locations throughout the cemetery and then covered with grass or other material to otherwise camouflage it. If a grave robber fell into one of these pits, they would likely be seriously injured or even killed. Despite these measures, grave robbing continued to be a problem. Enter Burke and Hare, two men with a sinister business plan. With the increased security measures taken to protect graves, they were forced to look for an alternative way to obtain their bodies. Their solution was as morbid as it was profitable. They turned to murder. So, on a dark November evening in 1827, the pair sold their first unburied body to Dr. Knox. In the beginning, Burke, Hare, Laird, and McDougall were employed in legitimate occupations. However, on November 29, 1897, things took a very dark turn. That evening, one of the tenants named Donald passed away due to natural causes. Donald had made a deal with Laird and Hare to pay for his room and boarding when his pension arrived, but unfortunately he passed away before the pension did arrive. In addition, Laird and Hare had lent him money, which was also to be repaid with his pension. They now had to forfeit the money for the room and board and for the loan that they gave to Donald. Hare, feeling upset about the loss of his money, told the police about the death and assumed that the parish would pay for the burial. While waiting for the coffin to arrive, Burke proposed an illegal plan to sell Donald's body to the medical school since he had no family to claim him. Hare agreed, thinking that they could recoup some of their funds by selling the body. When the authorities arrived with the coffin, Burke and Hare watched over them as they placed Donald's body into the coffin and nailed it shut. They left and made arrangements for the parish to pick up the body later that day. Once the men had left, Burke and Hare removed Donald's body from the coffin and replaced it with objects to simulate the weight of a human being. They then released the coffin to the parish, and it was picked up and buried in the local cemetery. With their plan progressing well, they set out to find a buyer. They went to the surgical college and asked for directions to Dr. Monroe, the man who would purchase bodies. Through a series of unfortunate coincidences, they ended up at the home of another doctor, Dr. Knox. We talked about Dr. Knox. He was known to have the most students in the area and consequently had the greatest need for fresh bodies. Dr. Knox paid the men £10 for Donald's body. This one transaction set into motion a chain of tragic events that led to the deaths of at least 16 individuals in one of the deadliest crime sprees in Scottish history. In late January 1828, just a few months after selling the body of Donald, Burke and Hare found their next victim. Joseph the miller was staying at the boarding house and became seriously ill with a fever. As his condition rapidly deteriorated and he became delirious, Burke and Hare decided to end his suffering out of what they perceived to be mercy. They began discussing how best to kill Joseph and ultimately settled on suffocation. This is a method that they would perfect in the coming months. Just a warning, this next area is graphic. Burke and Hare developed this method of murder that left no trace. One man would force the victim's mouth shut with one of his hands and use the other to block the victim's nose, while the second man would sit across their chest, making it even more difficult for them to breathe and almost impossible for them to move. They used this method to murder Joseph that night, which was viewed as a precursor to the more savage methods that they would use to acquire their victims in the future. While Donald had died of natural causes, Joseph was killed at the hands of Burke and Hare directly. They sold Joseph's body to Dr. Knox, who paid them again for this body. The success of these two crimes led the two men to begin to search for more victims and to coldly calculate their abductions and murders. They were now in the business of supplying fresh cadavers to medical schools, and the demand for bodies was high. Abigail Simpson was the third victim of William Burke and William Hare. According to Hare's confession, she was an Irish woman who had been staying at their lodging house in Edinburgh in 1827. Hare claimed that Abigail was an alcoholic who had been staying there for a few weeks. I should point out that she was brought there by Laird and Hare. One evening, while she was heavily intoxicated, Hare saw an opportunity to kill her for profit and called Burke to come back and help with the murder. When Burke arrived, Abigail was passed out in a bedroom on the second floor of the lodging house. At that time, Hare held her down while Burke suffocated her by covering her mouth and nose. They left her body in the bedroom overnight while they left to find a buyer for her body. The next day, they took Abigail's body to Robert Knox's dissection rooms and sold it for £10. Again, a substantial amount of money at that time. Despite selling 3 bodies to Knox, there were no real questions asked about where they were coming from. Burke and Hare would often make up excuses about where they got these bodies, and they were viewed as plausible enough. However, Abigail's friends noticed her disappearance and reported it to the police. Mary Patterson, a friend of Abigail's and a future victim of Burke and Hare, may have become suspicious of their activities and threatened to report them, leading to her own murder. Unsurprisingly, based on these men's personalities, the murders did not seem to affect their day-to-day activities. They went about their daily routines. Even their wives did not seem to act suspicious. Their next victim, Hare couldn't even remember his name, and we don't know much about him. Hare referred to him in his confession as an Englishman. The man was described to be in his 40s and a salesman in Edinburgh. Although when he met Burke and Hare, he was unemployed. Also, he was very ill. Just like the others, he was brought to the back bedroom, suffocated, and when darkness fell, he was delivered to Knox and paid £10 without any questions asked. Another interesting point is the fact that the ladies in Burke and Hare's life did not seem to ask any questions about where all this money was coming from. You'd think that between their wives and Dr. Knox, a lot of these crimes, if not all of them, could have been prevented. In their confessions, they adamantly deny the involvement of their wives in the crimes. On April 8th, 1828, Mary Patterson went out with her friend and roommate Janet Brown to a public house where they ran into William Burke. Burke was immediately taken with the duo and invited them to his table for some drinks. During the subsequent trial, Janet Brown testified that Burke's advances were unwanted, but that Mary seemed more receptive. Regardless, the trio drank heavily on that night. The next morning, they went to Burke's brother's house, whose name was Constantine, where they had a very large breakfast together and continued drinking more whiskey. Mary eventually fell asleep in the back bedroom while Burke and Hare left to get more food and alcohol. When they returned, they found that Helen McDougall had come over to Constantine's house and began arguing with Burke about why he has these two ladies here with him at Constantine's house. The argument escalated, and Burke hit McDougall hard enough to cut her forehead open. Janet Brown testified that she was very alarmed by their fight and tried to wake Mary up so that they could leave. Burke intervened and ushered Janet out the door before she could wake Mary. Janet left but returned shortly later to gather her friend. But during the time she was gone, Burke and Hare spoke and decided to use suffocation, their preferred method of killing, to murder Mary Patterson, despite being in a different home and them being seen with the victim the entire night before in public. When Janet returned to get Mary, she was told that Mary had gone to town with Burke and it was unknown when the two would return. Janet was suspicious and returned a few hours later, but was again told that Mary had not returned yet. After the third time she came back and there was still no sign of Mary, she reported it to police. But little was done, probably because of the social standing of Janet. 5 hours after Mary's disappearance, Burke and Hare carried her body to Knox's dissection room, where one of Knox's assistants recognized her as a woman from town.
I lost the audio here, but Burke claimed to have bought the body from a woman near the city gates.
And the assistant accepted this explanation. In an unusual turn of events, Knox hired a local painter to create a portrait of Mary who was considered exceptionally beautiful. Before painting her, the painter asked Burke if he could cut off some of her hair. Knox paid Burke £8 and let him keep the 2 shillings that were found clutched in Mary's hands. The murder of Mary Patterson was a significant deviation from Burke and Hare's typical motives, as she was well known in the community, and they killed her at somebody else's house after being seen with her all night in public. It seems risky. Despite the evidence pointing towards Burke and Hare, the crime never was investigated, possibly again due to Janet and Mary's social standing within the community. Mrs. Docherty was Burke and Hare's next victim. She was a former laundry maid in her early 60s who lived in the Westport district of Edinburgh. She was described as being a stout woman and would often be seen walking around the area. One day, according to Hare, sometime in the early spring of 1828, Burke found Mrs. Docherty sleeping off drink in a pile of straw in the stable. He began to wake her up and offer her more alcohol. Once she was extremely intoxicated, they suffocated her in their usual manner and left her body in the barn until the following day when they took it to Dr. Knox. In an unfortunate twist of fate, a few months later, Elizabeth's daughter Margaret was also murdered by Burke and Hare. This murder is the outlier in some ways because there's actually a lot of information about this victim. However, what I have found is that the information is largely fictionalized. It portrays Margaret as the daughter of a murdered woman looking for her killers, and she got too close to the truth. On the contrary, according to Burke's confession, they met her at a public house. They enticed her back to the boarding house with a promise of alcohol, and when she was highly intoxicated, Burke placed her face down on the bed and pressed her face into the bed until she suffocated. It seems like a pure tragic coincidence that she was killed by the same people who killed her mother. Around that same time, Burke had been searching for their next victim in town. He thought he had found the perfect target, a frail old man walking alone. He had even begun to befriend him, but just as Burke was about to invite him back to the boarding house, he spotted an old woman and a young boy in the crowd. Burke approached them and learned that they were from Glasgow and that it was a grandmother and grandson, and they were searching for friends in the Edinburgh area. This was an ideal opportunity for Burke and Hare because no one in Edinburgh knew their name and they didn't even know who they were. There was little risk. They invited the duo back to the boarding house and they agreed. After a night of drinking, they all went to bed, and Burke and Hare snuck into the woman's room in the early hours of the morning and suffocated her in her sleep. To make matters worse, the woman's grandson was in the adjoining room and became concerned for his grandmother. Burke's wife, McDougall, consoled the boy while Burke and Hare committed their crimes in the room next door. Later, they realized that they had to get rid of the boy because he was a witness, and they suffocated him as well before stuffing both bodies into a barrel. The following day, Burke and Hare brought the bodies to Dr. Knox, but because they had been carelessly stuffed into those barrels, they were damaged, and Knox paid them slightly less for the bodies than he paid for previous ones. Burke and Hare were both involved in the murder of an elderly woman who worked as a scavenger, essentially sifting through ash and debris to find small items of value. The woman, known as Effie, would occasionally sell scraps of leather to Burke, who used them for repairing shoes in his cobbler's business. He knew this woman. One day, Burke invited Effie to Hare's stable, which he used as a workshop, and gave her some whiskey. It's possible that this was done as a payment for a previous transaction or as payment for leather scraps. Anyway, Hare joined in on the drinking, and together they drank until Effie became unconscious. When she fell asleep on the pile of straw, they suffocated her by placing cloth over her face. According to the confession, they then sold her body to Dr. Knox for £10. This is where I'm going to stop part 1. This script is already 8 pages long, and we're only about halfway through the victims. If you want to check out part 2, then hit that subscribe button because that video is coming out soon. So I hope to see you all on part 2, where we will discuss the rest of the victims, the trials, and the outcome of the case. As always, everybody, thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.